Serious, what dark family secret were you let in on once you were old enough? My dad secretly had a vasectomy after I was born. After my mom lying to him about taking birth control resulted in my birth. Our family is great at communication and conflict resolution. The great question here is if you have any siblings? I was number 4. He knew she was cheating when she got pregnant with number 5. I'm in a similar but very different boat. I'm number 5. My dad got the snip after number 4. I'm 100% my dad's son. Snip didn't take. My great-aunt's husband killed his first wife. Then killed her. They lived in Puerto Rico and he fled to NYC so my great-uncles wouldn't kill him. They found out where he was, came here, killed him, and went home. Edit, typo. Isn't it scary how succinct the explanation of things like this can be? I dunno. I had to read that first sentence 5 times to get it. What's so difficult? He killed her, then killed her again, and one more time for good measure. I always thought my 2 older brothers got addicted to DS because of their own decisions and the people they hung out with. It turns out that my dad had been feeding them pills since they were about 10 to shut them up. Years I held resentment against them for not being good older brothers like they should have, only to find out that it was my father who I had praised all those years that was truly evil. Wow, that really is dark. How are your brothers doing now? Edit, typo. My uncle didn't die in a car accident. He killed his mistress and then killed himself by crashing his car with her body in the trunk. Dude, here's a family story I refer to as the accident. For years my older sister's bio dad
portray the story way better than a movie ever could. Edit. THX for all the upvotes, 3.
She didn't find out until she was a teenager. It was a painted the ceiling with his brain accident. Anyway, fast forward 30-some years and my sister and is constantly treating her children poorly. It's Easter Sunday and our younger sister is introducing her boyfriend to our family. And it's his first meal with us. Think Motor Norman Rockwell style all-out meal but with a bunch of kids and family. But my older sister won't stop yelling at her kids. My dad, who has been her only active father, finally snaps and tells her to knock it off. She, a 40-something-year-old woman, pulls the "you're not my dad" line like a SH-tie teenager. That man goes from calm to red, stood up, veins bulging from his head and absolutely screams, "Yeah? You're effing child harasser?" Dad blew his effing head off. He never had to deal with your bullshit. And that's how everyone in our family found out what the accident really was and why it happened. That story sure was a wild ride. I hope your sister got some help. And her kids. Not exactly dark, but I found out my father wrote P novels under a pen name to make ends meet when I was a baby. I've been trying to find one ever since. My dad's first cousin is serial killer Kenneth McDuff. We saw the America's Most Wanted episode when it aired and were so surprised to hear about a McDuff, not knowing he was a relative. 1946, November 17, 1998, was an American serial killer. He was convicted in 1966 of murdering 16-year-old Edna Sullivan, her boyfriend, 17-year-old Robert Brand, and Brand's cousin, 15-year-old Mark Dunham, who was visiting from California. They were all strangers whom McDuff abducted after noticing Sullivan. McDuff repeatedly at her before breaking her neck with a broomstick. Supreme Court ruling Furman v. Georgia. He was paroled in 1989 and went on to kill again. He was executed in 1998, and is suspected to have been responsible for many other killings. Jesus H. Christ, they effing paroled him after he had been given 3 death sentences commuted to a life sentence? You can thank the war on DS for his parole. Texas prisons were bursting at the seams due to the mandatory minimum D sentences. At the same time, Texas prisons were under court-ordered federal supervision due to poor conditions such as overcrowding. They couldn't build prisons fast enough, so they had no choice but to let people out. So they let the triple murderer with a life sentence out instead of a minor D offender? That's mind-bogglingly stupid. Not super dark or super secret, but when I had to do a project on my family tree in elementary school, one of the questions was, when did your family immigrate to America and why? For one of my great-grandfathers, my grandma told me life was very hard back in his country, and it was getting dangerous to stay there. And for a long time I thought, yeah, I can see that. It was probably hard for a teenager living in Poland with World War I right around the corner. And I'm sure it was. But it turns out it's even harder and more dangerous when you're a teenager who has slept with a married woman and then accidentally killed her husband when he confronted you. I can see why she didn't want me to put that on my elementary school project. Edit, wrong World War. I just pulled up his Ellis Island records and he immigrated in 1912 aboard the Carpathia in August. This makes me wonder how many of those projects are basically lies. I bet many parents don't want their kids saying some sh like, well, after my grandma's sister was beheaded, they decided to pack up and come here. It's a terrible project. My adopted kids all have struggled with it for many reasons. The last one just made a whole bunch of sh up and turned it in. I told her it was fine, but she certainly didn't actually learn what they were trying to accomplish. Yeah, depending on your region, you could have a lot of horrific refugee stories. For adopted kids, they could always adopt their adoptive parents' history, but I think making sh up would be more fun. Why the neighbors moved. Trigger warning for violent crime. I was pretty young when this happened, so the details won't be perfect, but the story is otherwise true. I grew up in a coastal town and we had some neighbors whom I really liked. My parents were friends with them. Their kids were roughly my age. Wonderful. We played together all the time. One day they very suddenly moved. I was a bit confused as there had been no clue that they were going. I remember some police cars and the moving vans weeks later. But that was it. My mother told me that the kid's grandmother had become very ill. The cops came to tell the family, and they left emergently to care for her and never came back. I was only about 5. Seemed legit. Many years later, as an adult, and long since moved away from that area, my parents and I were reminiscing over our old home. I mentioned that I wondered whatever happened to them. That's when my mom told me the truth. The parents had gone out that night on a date and left the kids with a 14-year-old babysitter. When they returned home, they found the sitter murdered. Someone had broken into the home and then killed the sitter. My mom stated the cops think the sitter pretended to be the only one home to protect the kids. When the parents got home, they checked the kids were safe and set them back to sleep. The police obviously immediately came. Once the kids were hard asleep, the parents picked them up, put blankets over their heads, asked the cops to be silent as they walked them out, and took them out of the house. They gave the kids the same story my parents told me. Grandma was sick and they were going to live with her. Grandma dutifully played along with the ruse for several weeks until the parents could find a new home to live in. The kids were kept unaware of what had happened just mere feet from them, as they didn't want the kids to be forever terrified of it happening again. Not sure if the kids ever eventually figured out the truth of that one. Quick thinking by those parents. Made a workable lie up on the spot. That babysitter's a hero too. Yeah, I'm super glad the kids were safe, but I can't stop thinking about that poor terrified 14-year-old child. Saving those kids before she died horribly. That was someone else's child. My grandmother married her second husband entirely for money. Her daughters both liked to joke about her intentionally giving him a heart attack. He had heart problems but liked to eat unhealthy food, and the rumor goes she would put extra salt and butter on his food until he finally kicked the bucket. Here's a dark secret I am keeping myself. My late Phil pretty much did this to himself. My partner knows Phil stopped doing his prescribed walking and ate lots of fast food after Mill died. That was too obvious to hide, since we went to live with him for a while. What I kept to myself were the multiple unopened bottles of Xarelto I found when we were clearing out that house. Also another one I've forgotten the name of. Presumably, he kept refilling the script so his doctor wouldn't catch on. But then he chucked them in a drawer and only took them when we came to visit. He died emotionally when Mill passed on. They'd been genuinely devoted to each other and she was his world. It took 16 months for his body to catch up. He had a massive stroke and died a day or so later. My grandma didn't get her breast cancer treated. Grandpa died and she just ignored it. She was destroyed, so she basically committed suicide so she could be with him. Yep, similar thing happened to me. Grandpa had a long and awful battle with Alzheimer's while my grandmother was getting treated for ovarian cancer. Grandpa died first and Grandma immediately stopped treatment and died 6 months later. I didn't find out she intentionally refused treatment until recently. I knew my grandfather was a coal miner, and that he was really involved with the union. But it wasn't until after he died that I found out just how much of a union man he was. If something needed blowing up or someone needed to not be breathing anymore, they called Gramps. After he died, my brother remembers some men coming to visit Gran and giving her a lot of envelopes. She took off for a year-long vacation in Europe after that. Ironic how unions were most powerful when they basically functioned like the mob. Modern-day unions should be taking notes. Yay, now only police unions get away with acting like the mob. They took notes. That my biological mother used to give me H and Valium as a baby and toddler to control me, then drop me off at my grandmother's house when she couldn't afford to share, so I'd go through withdrawals but no one would know what was wrong. Needless to say, I was put up for adoption to get me away from that. Jesus, I hope you're doing okay now. Thank God, yes, very well and healthy, and successful in my happy way. Hey, I'm a total stranger on the internet and you don't know me, but I'm so effing happy for you. Thank God. Ooh, I've noticed that this is more common than weird. I hope you're well now. Thank you. Due to my grandfathers. I'm a darn miracle. Growing up, I always knew my parents had marital issues, constant fighting. A couple times dad disappeared for a few days living in his car. Issues with drinking. But they stayed together, and when I asked why didn't they divorce, they always said they loved each other too much. And in the past few years, things seem to have gotten better. My parents in fact are now so comfortable in their relationship that they make jokes about all the awful stuff they've done to each other in front of me. What I've managed to put together is, my parents met when they were 14 and my mother was dating an 18-year-old, and my dad would relentlessly ask her out until she eventually dumped her boyfriend for my dad. My mother went on to university after college, we're UK, whereas my dad dropped out of college and went straight into work while constantly drinking and partying. It was at one of these parties, while my mum was studying, that he cheated on my mum with someone from their old secondary school, so she dumps him. Barely a year later my dad realizes he doesn't know how to do anything for himself. No one else wants him and he goes crawling back to my mum. She agrees to take him back, but only if he marries her, not immediately but eventually, she said. He agrees, and a short year after that, age 22 now, she's already pressuring him to propose. He fumbles it frankly, we're in Paris, but forgot the ring and proposed back in the hotel room after they'd visited the Eiffel Tower that day, which was her dream proposal. But she says yes. A month after they're married, mum pressures him into having a child that he doesn't want, and 9 months later I was born. They soon realize how hard having a child is and basically pawn me off on my grandparents for the rest of my childhood. After me there were 2 more accidental babies, and each time my dad threatened to leave her if she didn't abort them. She managed to convince him to stay while keeping my siblings by promising he wouldn't have to raise them. He didn't, but neither did she, frankly. I did. And that is only what happened before shortly after I was born. If I carried on into my childhood, we'd be here for years. What they sold to me as the perfect love story, been together since they were 14, proposed in Paris, soon married and had children because of pure love, is in fact a bunch of skewered half-truths from a horrible twisted love map of my mother's manipulation and my father disappointing her time and time again. Our parents' generation is screwed up. It's how The Notebook came off as a romance instead of a horror story. My Uncle Harris Ed, my mom. I don't understand how he is still welcome in the family. Familial soirée is one of the most horrifying, damaging crimes, and it is also probably the most covered up, rug-swept crime. I will never understand it either. He's a good man who made some bad choices, and nobody is perfect, and God forgives those who pray. My family. My mother always asks me if I'm sure that happened about her ex-husband, and coincidentally my father, even when there was literally photographic evidence used in court. She really believes she'll gaslight me into thinking I imagined all of it one day, because she knew and didn't give a sh because he was making a lot of money at work out with selling pics of my siblings and I being s'd that is Lamau. I am consistently surprised by how ubiquitous this situation is. If someone Harris Ed someone in my family, I can't wrap my brain around considering letting them be a part of the family anymore. Mind-boggling, isn't it? I'd see that as enabling. That my grandma didn't lose her leg to cancer. She lost it because she got injured helping my grandpa fix the roof. And my grandpa was too cheap to have it fixed properly, so he told the doctor to cut it off. Then he beat the crap out of her for life. Poor woman. That's hurt my heart. Yup, my grandpa was a real sob. So glad I have no memories of him. He died when I was 3. My mother grew up in the American South. Her brother died in his early 20s and she always told me it was a freak accident. A bullet came through the window killing him. They lived in a rural area, so I never questioned it. One year, I inherited an old Korean War officer's sword after my grandpa passed. My mom freaked out and told me that it was too dangerous to keep and that we should sell it or get a safe to lock it up in. I thought it was weird, so I asked my dad and he got this sad look on his face. Turns out my mom's brother was brutally murdered with a similar sword in the 80s. He had gotten involved with some dealers and they thought he had snitched about one of their big deals that got busted. No idea why they decided to use a sword, but it was pretty effed up to hear about. My mom had to ID the body. I found this out when I was 16, but she never directly acknowledged it until years later. My mom said he was just trying to make some extra cash by introducing people who partied to the dealers. I'm about his age now and I can see how he just thought he was making a quick buck, never thinking something like that would get him killed. Blades were often used to enact punishment or execution in many D circles. A machetazo, in some Latin D rings, is the act of getting hit with a machete across your face. The resulting scar, usually across your cheek, served as a reminder that you fell out of line, went behind your boss's back, etc. To this day, high-ranking cartel members are often executed by knife. As for why a sword? To be honest, don't know. But considering you inherited one and her brother was killed by a similar sword. Assuming similar means identical or close to identical. Could be that the perpetrator was bestowed a similar rank title to have that sword. However, these swords are often totally ornamental and often don't carry sharpened edges. I have a friend who inherited a US Mexico officer's sword and he showed it to me. I fence, so I'm attracted to sword things, and yeah, dull edges. So it's odd that someone would go through the lengths to sharpen a sword like that for an execution. They often are also made of softer and more corrosion-resistant metals and not really built to be actual combative blades. But TBH, many swords look identical. Your mom probably just associated any sword with that day, and I don't really blame her. Even I as a sword fencer don't get hung up the precise origin of swords. True story, neither did the people of the medieval period. The word sword just meant any sword, with the only distinctions were if it was a one-handed or two-handed. My cousin, we're Mexican, lives in a big city in Mexico. He was in a gang as a teen and they attacked him with a machete for leaving to get a real job when his GF got pregnant. He nearly died, is missing a chunk of ear and has issues with both his arms. This attempted murder was in front of his daughters. To add insult to injury, we found out that one of the assailants is actually my grandfather's grandchild as well. Grandpa had another family and one of his grandkids unknowingly tried to kill his own cousin. When I turned 21, my grandfather told me a story about his older brother that I had never heard. My great-uncle was a big boozer for most of his life. He passed at 92 and by then had switched from liquor to beer and wine. He also cut down to 1 pack of cigarettes a day instead of 2 after he had half a lung removed. Pap and my uncle grew up on a farm in the 30s and 40s. Mostly the family ran the farm by themselves, but from time to time they would hire drifters on as farmhands. In 1950, my uncle and one of the farmhands were out drinking and they were driving back to the farm in my uncle's convertible. My uncle was the one driving and he misjudged a turn that had a steep bank on the right side. He ran the car up the embankment, which was steep enough to flip it. My uncle was thrown from the car, but the farmhand he was drinking with was only halfway out of the car when it landed. Pap said he was severed clean into 2 pieces. Because the farmhand was just a drifter without any family to make much fuss, and because the Korean War had just started. My uncle was able to enlist and avoid any criminal charges. He was in Korea until the end of the war. That was the only time I've ever heard that story told, and although I would never be someone who has more than a few drinks before getting behind the wheel, it's something that definitely sticks in my mind. And it's a story I'll tell my own kids when they get their license. I was waiting for so we buried that drifter in the back 40 and planted a tree above his grave. If it had happened on the farm, that probably would have been my great-grandmother's solution. She was a hard, mean woman. When she died at 98, Pap said, "Dad's probably up there holding the pearly gates closed so she can't get in." I think that my uncle's wreck, or maybe just his heavy drinking in general, affected my Pap. He was as much of a man's man as you could be. Farmer turned steel mill worker turned trucker, 250 pounds, 0% body fat, afraid of nothing, almost superhumanly strong. But I never saw him drink more than 2 beers at a time, even when everyone else was kicked back relaxing. And even that was rare. He died when I was 28 and I don't think in all that time I ever saw him touch hard liquor. I miss him. Dad's probably up there holding the pearly gates closed so she can't get in. Sorry you miss your Pap, but that's the funniest thing I've read all day. I found out when I was in my early 30s that my mom hadn't only had 4 kids, but actually 6, but gave 2 up for adoption before I was born. Also, I was the last baby she had with some rando before she married my stepdad, and she had intended to give me up for adoption as well. Silver lining? One of the babies she gave up contacted her a few years after I learned about this, and now I have an awesome new brother. Found out about a half-sibling later in life too. He's nice and I felt oddly comfortable and familiar around him immediately. It's extremely unfortunate though the rest of my family wants nothing to do with him and are mad at me for reaching out at all. I only get met with anger or non-answers when I press the issue too. My parents and sibling have all gotten really weird in the decade or so this all unfolded. There's so much going otherwise I don't think it's the main reason, but I feel like I'm not being told something about the situation I should know. That's sad. My surprise half-sibling made contact in 2009. We share a father. We have all welcomed her. My mother's side also adore her. She is my best friend now. My grandpa can't have kids, but my mother still has 3 siblings. The old Jonas Venture special. My science is quite potent. Great-grandma died from a botched abortion when she got pregnant a 7th time. Ugh, this is effing tragic. Finally I got one. From when I was aged 6 to 13, my mom dated a fellow named Murray. We all lived together in an old farmhouse. Murray was a wonderful father figure to us, but he also had a drinking and driving problem. And after a particularly nasty accident, Mom waited until he came home from the hospital and was well enough to take care of himself before leaving. The whole time we lived there, my sister and I never went down into the basement, as it was infested with spiders. I always thought it was because of the drinking and driving she left him. But as it turns out, that was only part of it. The other being that he had a massive grow-op for W in the basement. Mom stated had the police found out about this, she would have lost custody of us. Murray has long since passed, but he would have had a giggle that W is legal here now. Older truck driver at work did 5 years for having a roach in a tin in his pocket. I haven't talked to him much, but he was talking to a couple guys about seeing full-size billboards for dispensaries in the area and how he got so mad the first time he just started laughing hysterically. My uncle caught some charges for having a roach in his car. He was giggly and lost when I gave him a tour of my cannabis processing lab, while standing in front of like $300,000 in extraction equipment. Him and my dad kept saying back in our day, you picked out most of the seeds and it was good to go. It was common to use an upside down frisbee to clean your W because the edges would catch the seeds.